can you keep a secret?
Changing hearts and minds.
Changing hearts and minds.
Changing hearts and minds.
Changing hearts and minds.
Changing hearts and minds. Changing hearts and minds. Changing hearts and minds.
Changing hearts and minds.
Welcome to Change Your POV podcast. You're listening to Changing Hearts and Minds, a show about reviving the warrior spirit and remembering the past to improve our future. I'm your host, Jeff Adamick. Let's get this party started.
Ladies and gentlemen, am I totally screwed or what? You're funny.
I want to discuss all this behavior.
Let me out of here!
Welcome to this episode of Changing Hearts and Minds. It's been a while, I'm not going to lie to you guys, that I've had this guest on. He actually started off being like the only guest that I would have. It seemed things have changed up a little bit. I've gotten a bunch of people that have come on lately, but it's time to bring it back because I really do enjoy doing these history episodes with this gentleman. From Neophyte in the Woods, let's welcome back Andrew Macdowell. Andrew, how you doing, buddy?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good.
So it's Sunday morning, and I've taken Andrew away from fishing this morning to come in and record with us.
You haven't taken me away from fishing. Fishing will be there after we're done.
Well, fishing's never done. Isn't that right? I mean,
It's true.
We never have to stop fishing. At least it's like golf. It's like you can go out there and not be good at it, but it's still enjoyable.
Exactly. And I'm terrible at golf too.
Oh yeah, well, I'm horrible at golf. For years, I have to turn sideways to get the ball to go where I want to go because it's going to slice that way.
Yep.
No matter what.
Yep. I've just started playing my slice too. It just made it a lot easier.
Yeah. Instead of learning how to do it right, I just adjust my negative fallacies in the game to fit the needs of the game.
Exactly. We're handy capable, not handicapped.
That's right. You actually came up with the idea for this show. And you came up with the idea for this show quite a while ago. And when I first started looking into it, it was a lot of information. I mean, there's just you could literally do probably your whole podcast. You can do a whole podcast series just on this one topic. Obviously, if you've clicked on it, you already know it's called Silent Service: The History and Tales of Submarine Warfare. And the tales, we're going to go into some of the stories, just so you guys know out there. If you don't hear a story about submarines that you wanted to hear in this episode, it is not because we blew it off. I had to pick and choose which stories we put in the episode and which stories we didn't, because there's so much information out there.
There's so much. And there's a lot of information that's hard to parse for its truth or fallacy, because there's so much mythology built up around submariners and especially submariners during World War II that it's, tough to penetrate the stories.
Right. And there's, you also have the fact that Hollywood does a very good job of making movies, based on real events. Right. So you watch U-571.
How deep does this thing go?
Well, she'll go all the way to the bottom if we don't stop her. Normally we try not to get below 150 feet. Any deeper, the leaks overwhelm the pumps. These S-boats are antiques. Older than most of the crew.
100 feet.
Aye. Speed, Mr. Hammond. Put a pipe patch on and lash it with marlin. The yard can fix it when we get back to port. Aye, sir. Relax, gentlemen. She's old. She'll hold.
Which is the one with
McConaughey,
with McConaughey and Bon Jovi, and a great friggin' movie, by the way. I mean, a great movie. I always say that because I think John Bon Jovi, being from New Jersey, he's only ever done I think he's only been in 3 or 4 movies. Only 2 of them did he not play himself. I think New Year's Eve he plays himself pretty much in that movie, but then he's in one where he's a drug lord in some Colorado town where they're all smoking weed. I think there's a movie out there that he's in doing that. And then there's this movie, which I think is his best movie, because I think the movie is very good. But that movie, based on a true story, I think it ends with where it's based on a true story is the fact that there was a war between the Americans and the Germans in the Atlantic, and that the German U-boats did have those devices on them. The cryptic devices that the man who invented computers.
Yep.
That did happen. That's about where it ends.
That's the totality of the accuracy of
Hunt
of
for
that
Red
movie.
October, just so you guys know that we won't mention that one, because that one also, yes, based on a true story, but it was a actual boat, not a sub that incident happened with. And so we're not going to go into that. And obviously there was no, Jack Ryan did not have anything to do with that. He's not a real character, no matter what anyone says. So that's those are two of the things. So Hollywood has a very good way of making us think that there's so many things. And you've got stuff like, and this is one word that we don't go in the show because it's for those of you who listen to me outside of Changing Hearts and Minds and the Change Your POV network, you guys know that I do a lot of shows that are on like conspiracy theories and paranormal stuff. And that's just something that I'm interested in and that I know a little bit about. And so I go on those shows. And although I'm not putting out any false things on those shows, as you see, I'm more of a debunker when you listen to those shows than anything else. Talking about quackers, which is another word you'll hear in the submarine community, is not something you're going to find in the show either, because that's kind of and quackers, guys, so that you understand, it is a nautical term used by the submarine community about animals or sounds that happen underwater that are unexplained. There are a bunch of stories in the submarine community about quackers and things that have gone on during the Cold War, and incidents with underwater animals and stuff like that I didn't throw into this because it's not what this show's about either. So if you're looking for that with this show, you're not going to find it either. And not that I'm blowing those off; those are real stories that did happen. They do have part of the historic part of this, but that's not what this episode is about. Those are just two disclaimers that I wanted to put before we got into this show and into everything. Andrew, your intent was not for me to talk about quackers, was it?
No, I really. First of all, I've never heard the term before today, and second of all, that stuff makes me insane. So no, I don't want to talk about that.
And if you guys heard the Halloween episode, you can tell that me and Andrew get knee deep into that paranormal stuff, and we're like, wait a minute, and not insane in a bad way. It's just that you will go down a rabbit hole that you just won't ever come out of. And Andrew still got me convinced that little creatures in the woods are
puckwudgie, man. They're real.
Puckwudgies are real. Sure,
they're real.
Sure, they are.
It wasn't my overactive imagination and 3 5-hour energies before 4 a.m. Had nothing to do with that.
All right, so let's get into it then. Let's get into the Secret Service, the history of submarine warfare. Since the beginning of civilization, cultures have conducted war as a means to expand empires, to defend themselves from invading or intimidating regimes, or for financial control of commerce. It's human nature to win wars, and they've always found new and ever inventive ways to use every environment that they're exposed to conduct their warfare. From Hannibal's elephants to the Spanish Armada to dogfights and upcoming Space Force, which, yes, that's funny, but we will conquer the environment so that we can use it to fight and defeat our enemies, even if we have to create a reason to have a Space Force to fight enemies that don't exist yet. The drive to win war has even driven us below the waves of the most secret, mysterious environment left on planet Earth, the oceans of the world. Today we will talk about the Today we're going to talk about the historic timeline of what has been referred to as the Silent Service. We'll discuss submarine warfare. Besides Leonardo da Vinci's sketch of what he called a ship to sink other ships, that he kept secret to avoid contributing to making war more scary and violent than it was before, there was plenty of references in history to submersibles used for military and even non-military means. In 1758, an English mathematician named William Bourne wrote about secret plans for underwater navigation vehicles. In 1596, Scottish mathematician and theologian John Napier wrote about them in his book Secret Inventions. The only reliable historic proof of the first actual submersible was the design and build of in 1620 by Dutchman Cornelius Drebbel for King James I. It was propelled by oars, and there's actually an image of it that is used in the storyline. You can find that image online. I'll even link to it in the show notes so you can take a look at it. It looks like a turtle on the water with oars sticking out of it. In 1747, Nathaniel Simmons patented the first working ballast tank, which were nothing more than leather bags that could fill with water to assist in submersion. And so those of you who don't know, that's what ballast tanks are used for. You ever hear in the movies, they talk about ballast tanks, the ballast tanks are this or that. The ballast tanks are the device that actually helps a submarine get underwater. They fill the ballast tanks with water. It makes the ship less buoyant. The ship sinks underwater. Then they drain the ballast tanks, and the ballast tanks fill back up with air, and then they surface back up. Twisting the bags for use of an internal mechanism would empty the bags and allow the surfacing of the craft. Boom, submarines invented. The very first official military submarine was called the Turtle in 1775. It was a hand-powered, acorn-shaped craft designed by American John Bushnell, and it was able to carry one person and was the first to use screws for propulsion. We talk about ballast tanks, and I explained those. Now screws. Screws are nothing more than the propellers on the back of a submarine. And they're actually, I think, more of a military nautical term. You'll hear civilians say propellers. Military men will normally use the word screws. In the 1800s, American Robert Fulton designed the Nautilus. It was experimented with by the French, who gave up on experimenting with the design 4 years after they started. The British later considered to use Fulton's design to make themselves some submersible vehicles, but they never actually did it. It wasn't until 1864 that the first successful military operation to use submarines for active war was successful. It was done in Charleston Harbor, and it was achieved by the Confederate Navy. So, Andrew, talk to us about the American Civil War and what happened with how the Confederates, not even ever ended up being a real country, how their military is the military that successfully operated using submarines.
It just shows to go that, even losers sometimes get it right once in a while.
And enter the angry Confederate supportive emails we're going to get.
I'm just trying to get a little bit of press for you there, Jeff.
Thank you, buddy. Thank you, buddy. I appreciate it.
So in the American Civil War, the Confederate Navy, such as it was, designed and built a series of modern submarines, if you will. They were designed and built by a guy named Horace Lawson Hunley. They built 3 of them. The first was the Pioneer, and then the American Diver. They were both lost. One was scuttled because the Union was advancing on New Orleans and they didn't want it to fall into their hands. The American Diver was lost in choppy waters. It sunk while attempting to run an attack on a Union blockade ship. And then finally, we had the one that was marginally successful. And you'll see why I say marginally in a second. It was called the H.L. Hunley after its inventor. As Jeff said, in Charleston Harbor, there was a Union ship called the Housatonic. It was stationed at the entrance of Charleston Harbor and it was interdicting smugglers. They deployed the Hunley into the harbor and sent it towards the ship. The Hunley was armed with something called a spar torpedo. So in the old days, where there weren't torpedoes like we think of today with low screw in the back and you launch it out of a tube and it goes straight. Torpedoes were mines. They were IEDs basically, and they were used in land warfare to disrupt advances and later wars, and actually during the Civil War, blow holes in the lines. The Union troops at one point actually dug a massive mine. They were mines because they dug basically a massive mine and used a torpedo, just tons and tons and tons of dynamite to blow a hole in the Confederate lines. But in this case, the Hunley was armed with it was called a spar torpedo. It was a keg of dynamite basically attached to the end of a 20-foot spar, which is something from which you would hang a sail attached to the front of the boat.
So it was basically a pole with a bomb at the end.
Exactly. It was a pole with I think it actually had a screw on the end or some sort of nail, and they drove it into the wood of the Housatonic and deployed it. When they pulled back away from it, it tripped a fuse, and they actually succeeded in blowing up the Housatonic. And it sank in just about 5 minutes, just under it.
That's pretty. I mean, you think about now. I think people, when they think about ships sinking, they see in the movies and everything that these ships they sink in like record time, and it wasn't that way. Ships are pretty much built to try to stay afloat as best as possible, and the Titanic, for God's sakes, it took hours for it to finally sink, as most ships do. So when you think about these ships that sink in 5-10 minutes. They have to have a massive hole. I mean, you're talking about a massive hole for them to sink like that. So when you talk about it going in 5 minutes, it did its job fairly well. That must have been one hell of an explosion.
I know. I was just trying to Google how big the charge in the Hunley that they used. I don't have the size of it. So the attack itself was successful. Where I'll say it's not successful was the Hunley didn't make it back to shore. It's unclear exactly what happened, but suffice to say the Hunley disappeared. Whether it was sunk, damaged irreparably by the concussion from the explosion, or there was they asphyxiated themselves because obviously they had limited oxygen and didn't have carbon dioxide scrubbers. So there could have been some sort of carbon dioxide poisoning, but the Hunley sank and nobody found it for 100 plus years. It was recovered in 1995.
Yeah, that was the year I joined the Army. They discovered it. Then that's not them lifting it and raising it up to take a look at it. They just discovered it.
Yep.
Where it was at. I think over the years there was a lot of conjecture. If you go online and you look up the Hunley, you're going to find a lot of stories how they say they knew it lasted for an hour afterwards because of signals they had gotten from the water. They had an entire system set up. Upon successfully detonating, you're going to release these buoys that had these lights on them when you surface, and that when these lights will be seen from the shore, and those lights were seen. So they had reported initially, hey, successful, detonation. We've seen the signal lights from the Hunley. We know that they're okay. They saw the lights again 45 minutes later.
Yep.
Then there was nothing. And then hundreds of years later, they don't show back up the next morning where they're supposed to. And hundreds of years later, they had actually a myth that they probably had been, and this is what I think actually happened, whether they died instantly from the explosion or whether they survived the explosion. The explosion itself on the spar torpedo damaged the Hunley in some way that they could not operate it correctly. And it either sank to the bottom and they perished, or, as most believe, the concussion of the explosion was so great. I mean, you think about it sunk that ship in 5 minutes. That explosion probably sent a shockwave so detrimental through the water that they were close enough because they had to use a spar torpedo that it probably liquefied the insides of the guys inside the ship. They probably died during the explosion. Maybe the ship came up to the surface, bobbed, and its lights were on, so they thought they saw it, but then it sank back down to the bottom where they died. And I think when they finally raised it up, they showed that there was some damage done to the boat, that the boat was probably inoperable because it was hundreds of years. There was no way for them to check the bodies, but all the bodies were accounted for. The crew of 3, I believe it was accounted for. But yeah, I think that's what's probably what happened. They probably killed the Housatonic, or whatever the hell the name of the Housatonic, and themselves. Hence, enter the era of submarine warfare because of this operation.
And it was, depending on how you want to look at it, all downhill or all, smooth sailing from here in terms of the development. Basically, after this point, more and more countries saw the efficacy and potential that submarines had, and worked hard and spent a lot of money and a lot of time and hired a lot of really smart people to develop submarines or develop the technology that would enable them. Before you know it, we have submarines with diesel engines, periscopes, like all the things that you think of on a submarine within 30, 40 years are in development or in place. On May 17th of 1879, the USS Holland was launched.
1897.
1897, what did I say?
1879. You did the same thing I did earlier.
Yeah. So on May the 17th of 1897, the USS Holland was launched from the Crescent shipyards in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Jeff, do you want to give a little shout out to New Jersey there?
Oh, Elizabeth, New Jersey. If you guys ever watch if you guys watch Men of Honor.
Diving is the most dangerous job in the Navy. If it's lost underwater, the Navy diver finds it. If it's sunk, he brings it up. If he's lucky, he'll die young 200 feet beneath the waves, for that is the closest he will ever get to being a hero. My name is Master Chief Billy Sunday, and I am God.
The movie Men of Honor. The shipyard that they're talking about is the shipyard that they train at in that movie. The Navy has a long, deep-seated history in New Jersey as far as the Naval Weapons Station. Earl is there. Barnegat Bay is very, very big. Elizabeth, New Jersey. There's a lot of Navy training and Navy there's a lot of Navy type ship design and Navy R&D that's done in New Jersey on the coast of New Jersey.
And my recollection is that Elizabeth had the dirigible hangars there where it rained inside during World War II.
Yes,
or thereabouts.
Yeah. It's also those dirigible hangars. There is also the location where the Hindenburg crashed. Was where it was trying to land there in New Jersey, and that's where the Hindenburg disaster occurred.
So there's some side facts for us. So this USS Holland was designed and developed around the plans of an Irish inventor named John Philip Holland. There's the namesake of the boat, which he designed this in 1876. It was a design he called the Type 6 submarine. The United States Navy would later purchase this, and on April 11th of 1900, the Holland became the first submarine commissioned by the U.S. Navy.
I got something cool for you guys. This is going to be awesome. John Philip Holland designed the design that it was created on, except the actual USS Holland was built and designed for U.S. military by a guy named Lewis Nixon, Lieutenant Lewis Nixon. Now, if you guys remember back, there was a show that I did a bunch of shows on, Band of Brothers. We talked about this guy, me and Andrew did, on one of those shows. Mm-hmm. We talked about Lieutenant Nixon, who came from New Jersey, who was the main intelligence officer, right? This Lieutenant Nixon that designed this submarine was his grandfather. Boom.
That's really cool.
His grandfather, Lewis Nixon from Band of Brothers, his grandfather is the man who designed the USS Holland.
Mind blown.
Mind blown. I mean, boom. Well, what makes it a boom is that by no intent of our own, we talk about this now, but you and I were the ones who talked about how his grandfather was famous for being a naval designer in the show that we I do
remember. Full circle.
I do indeed. Full circle. That's my mind blown. I mean, you and I are the only two who were excited about that, but that's awesome.
Yeah,
I guess.
That's really cool. I never made that connection. That's really cool. And so, we start talking about the military and the world wars, and the first time we see subs really having a disparately large impact is during the First World War, specifically the U-boats of the German Navy.
Yeah, in the First Battle of the Atlantic. At the outbreak of the war, Germany had 20 U-boats available for combat. For the next 30 years of naval submarine warfare, it wasn't the Russians or the Americans that were the lead and the best at performing underwater submersible warfare. It was the German Navy. They really did lead the world in submersibles. The U-boats were one of the most terrified things. People were scared to death of these things, and with good reason. So the U-boats weren't just in World War II, they were in World War I, and there was 20 of them to begin with, right? So during the start of World War I, there was maritime law stated that submarines could not attack freighters or tankers without warning. This was known as what was called prize rules or cruiser rules in maritime law. The military pretty much followed maritime law, as well as most countries. Prize rules stated that submarines must surface and search maritime vessels, placing crews into a place of safety before sinking the vessels. This excluded lifeboats, except under extreme circumstances. So what that means is you couldn't just go and stop a merchant vessel, go on board, say, we're going to sink this ship because you're doing military operations. You couldn't put those guys on a lifeboat, launch the lifeboat, and then sink the vessel. You had to make account and take care of the people that were on those boats. So it became a pain in the ass for most U-boat crews, because who's got room to load an entire merchant vessel worth of guys on your U-boat and to take them to safety? First of all, they're going to be hostile at best. They're going to have access to operational things that are going on the U-boats that only you have. So I can almost understand the Germans' reluctance to follow these ridiculous rules, especially if you had evidence that you knew that this merchant vessel was operating as pretty much a spy ship by moving military supplies. The British introduced what they called Q ships. And these were ships transporting military men and equipment secretly for the war effort. And at first, believe it or not, both the Germans and the Americans publicly denounced the use of these things, because they were like, hey, you can't be doing this shit. You're just going to make it. The Americans specifically with the British were like, hey, you're going to make it really hard for us to keep above board and be
and keep sending you arms and equipment.
Yeah, we're sending you stuff. You're hiding it on boats. We're going to be culpable. You can't do this stuff. You've got to just put them on military ships to stuff. Well, the British were like, no. Don't want stuff sunk by the German U-boats. So, but what they did by saying we're going to use Q ships is they created a problem for the Germans that the Germans just blew off. So the German Navy therefore instituted what they since has been called unrestricted submarine warfare. And that is the term that you'll find most commonly when you do research on this, which meant that if the Germans decided that they thought that ship was transporting military equipment, it didn't matter. It didn't fall under prize law or cruiser law. We can just sink it. So on May 7th, 1915, a German U-boat fired upon and sank the RMS Lusitania, which was a British ocean liner passenger ship. The ship was transporting munitions. It was also transporting civilian passengers. 1,198 of the 1,962 passengers died. Because of the international outrage and the fact that 128 of the 139 U.S. citizens that were aboard it died, the attack gave way for the United States to push their way into World War I, and that was it. That was the end of U.S. not being
beginning
involved.
of the end.
Yeah, that was the beginning of the end for the Axis powers, or for the enemy.
Central powers.
Central powers, thank you. U.S., they were looking for a reason to get in the war anyway, so the British have kind of helped get the U.S. in, but also pushed the issue by, it's up in the air. Did the U.S. support this whole thing? We definitely use it propaganda-wise to promote us getting into the war full-fledged. So
that, the Zimmerman telegraph and some of the other kind of were inciting incidents that really just didn't give us much choice after a certain point.
Right. So even though the Germans made a strategic error in the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, they still maintained a supremacy as the premier underwater war fleet in the world. It was not halted with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, and going into World War II, the German U-boats would continue to be on top of the world's most feared and effective submarine warfighters. Now, why this happened was because the British kind of allowed the Germans to still utilize and practice submarine tactics as a part of they were helping the British forces by loaning them their fleets. So when you hear about after World War I, all the German military was disbanded, it was, but there were certain portions of the military that were allowed to continue because they were loaned out. And so the British inadvertently allowed the Germans to continue their supremacy of submersible and submarine warfare by kind of saying, hey, you're going to be like almost privateers for us. And you'll be allowed to maintain and keep your fleet and advance your fleet. And so that kind of comes around to bite everyone in the ass later on. So
and part of it was the post-war treaty basically capped the tonnage that you could have in a warship, and submarines were under the tonnage and they weren't explicitly exempted, so they were permitted.
Right. So in World War II, submarine warfare split into two main areas, right? You had the Atlantic and the Pacific, obviously. The Mediterranean Sea was also very active for submersible operations, but I just chalk that up to the Atlantic operations, if in my opinion. But so we won't go into that, splitting it into those two. It was particularly true for the British and the French, as well as the Germans. The Italians were also involved in massive submarine warfare, but achieved their greatest successes using midget submarines and human torpedoes, whatever that means. I didn't find anything on human torpedoes from the Italians, but
I didn't either. I also didn't look that hard because I think it would get really weird really quick.
Italian human torpedoes. The Italian subs that I'm used to are generally top piece of bread and a bottom piece of bread with a bunch of meat stuffed in the middle. And that's, when I think of Italian subs, it's the only thing I think of. So, I mean, that might be the Northeastern in me, but.
You're from New Jersey, man. It's the Mid-Atlantic. Get it right.
The Mid-Atlantic. New Jersey's not the Mid-Atlantic. It's still Northern Atlantic. It's like the edge. It's the edge.
Yeah, it's the edge. It's the edge. You're like on the border. Taint your hem, taint your ha kind of thing. Yeah.
That's right. So, I mean, Jersey Mike's, come on, man. We invented the best sub sandwiches ever. So
I've never had Jersey Mike's.
I don't know. I can't believe right now I'm regretting having you on this show. I can't believe I've allowed this bullshit on my show. Go ahead, buddy. Talk to us about the Atlantic Theater of Submarine Warfare.
Sure. So this is where basically the Germans again sought out to attack and sink Allied shipping to try to strangle the British and knock them out of the war through starvation and privation. Basically from the beginning of hostilities in Europe during World War II. The Americans continued to supply the British despite their neutrality, and British ships and American ships and Canadian ships would go back and forth and bring men and material and supplies material between North America and England, and the Germans were doing their level best to stop it. The early part of the war was very reminiscent of the latter part of World War II, Germans interdicted ship after ship after ship. And I have some stats in a little bit to kind of give you some idea of how much shipping was sunk by Germans. There were a lot of British submarines active as well in the Atlantic theater, particularly in the Mediterranean and off of Norway and in Scandinavia. They mostly took action against Axis warships, submarines, and merchant shipping. You don't see a lot of American submarines in the Atlantic, and that's because they were busy in the Pacific. And Jeff's going to talk about that in detail a little bit later. Is that right?
I mean, that's the one thing in the research, because you did the Atlantic stuff and I did the Pacific. Yep. Is that right? There was not a big U.S. submarine effort in the Atlantic, huh?
Nope. Not that I have seen or heard of, despite there being major sub bases in the modern day in New London and Groton and up and down the Atlantic coast. I don't see a lot of evidence that there was American submarines working in the Atlantic. I'm sure there were, not to the extent that they really engaged in the Pacific. With and that's not to say that they weren't there again, but they didn't play as major a role.
So Bon Jovi and Hudson from Aliens weren't out there rolling around in the Atlantic with Matthew McConaughey in tow. Okay, all right, fair enough.
Playing the bongos in the sub and doing that thing. No, they weren't there. They're hanging out on some Pacific island, eating coconuts and crabs. So initially, at the beginning of the war, Hitler ordered his subs to abide by prize rules, just like early in World War I. But they lifted this restriction by December of 1939, just because it wasn't feasible to do, and they were not being as successful as Hitler was hoping they would be.
Wait a minute. Are you telling me that Hitler and his guys decided to blow off the rules of? I mean,
I'm shocked by it too.
These guys are they're well known to follow things to the human letter. I mean, they did nothing inhumane, nothing out of ordinary. I mean, really?
I know.
Nazis breaking the rules. Shocking.
Assholes. Fucking Nazis. Say that once a day these days. By and large, the submarine attacks were done not in kind of mass attacks like you saw in World War I, but in smaller quote unquote wolf packs. Became the tactic for U-boats. Basically, the tactics would work as follows. A number of U-boats would be dispersed along the potential paths of a convoy. A U-boat or a plane would sight a convoy and signal its course, speed, and composition to high command. The submarine or plane would continue to shadow the convoy and reporting any changes of course. The rest of the wolf pack would then head to the first boat's position. Once the wolf pack of 3 or 4 subs was put together, they would begin a coordinated attack on the surface if they were engaging at night. At dawn, basically, the pack would withdraw and leave a single sub to follow it, and then begin the attack the next night. This worked really well at the beginning of the war, but later in the war, you saw an increase in warship and aircraft escorts. At that time, U-boat losses became extremely high. It was a dangerous job to begin with, but once you had escort carriers and destroyers and destroyer escorts flying around these columns with sonar and radar, depth charges, it became one. I mean, let's be honest, there are no safe jobs in the wartime military, but it became especially dangerous.
I'm pretty sure that being a pack clerk back in Washington D.C. during wartime is probably pretty safe. I'm not picking on them, but I'm just saying, you're in the military.
Comparably.
If the U.S. government fell, you would be treated like every other military person. But to say that there's no safe jobs, I'm not sure if that's safer than there's safer jobs than others. But yeah, I would definitely say that being a submariner during warfare, especially when you're dealing with culpable, technologically advanced, military, somebody else who has submarines. I'm sure that the submariners right now in the war on terror aren't worried about a suicide bomber hitting their submarine. But back then, it was. I agree with you there. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mentioned before I had some broad stats about the Battle of the Atlantic and what it meant both in terms of material but also human toll. So these are overall losses, and I'll dive into the U-boat losses or results in a second. On the Allied side, during the Battle of the Atlantic, from the beginning of the war to the end, 36,200 British, American, Allied sailors died. 3,600 merchant seamen. So those would be civilian folks. It resulted in the sinking of 3,500 merchant vessels and 175 warships.
Say that again. How many merchant vessels?
3,500.
Good Lord.
Yep. A lot.
That is a lot.
On the flip side of it, the Germans, and I don't have numbers for their merchant seamen, but I would assume it would be comparable or higher. Germany lost 30,000 sailors and 783 submarines during the course of the war.
783 subs. When you think about the war effort and the amount of money that went into World War II and the 6 billion or whatever the number is that I've said before of how many lives were lost during World War II, it really brings it. You're talking, all right, so a submarine is probably one of the most expensive things that you're going to build in a military arsenal, right? 700 plus of those submarines. No wonder the Nazis lost the war. I mean, they just strung themselves out. And there was plenty of U-boats left after the war was over. So how many of these damn U-boats did they fucking build? Jesus.
But I mean, that includes midget submarines, Italian subs. Like it includes everything. That's
but
large,
still, that's quite a lot, man. Even if you were only responsible, if the Nazis themselves were only responsible for 50%, that's still over 300. That's a lot.
It's a lot. And then just, so we can see how effective these U-boats were. And this is just based on some Googling. You can go to uboat.net if you want to find out more. During the war, U-boats sank 2,700, almost 2,800 ships. So of those, 3,200 or so, the balance, the majority were sunk by U-boats. That was a total of 14.1 million tons of shipping. So they accounted for about 70% of all Allied shipping in all theaters in the war and to hostile action. The most successful year for the U-boats was 1942, where they sunk 6 million tons of shipping alone just in the Atlantic.
Oh my God. Wow.
So it was a bloodbath. I mean, it was.
And when they say the North Atlantic is a graveyard for ships, they're not lying, huh?
They ain't lying.
Well, so over in the Pacific, it wasn't any better, to be quite honest with you. U.S. submarines, as well as some British and Dutch vessels, operated from bases at Cavite in the Philippines in 1941 and 42, and from Fremantle, Brisbane, Australia. Pearl Harbor, Trincomalee, Ceylon, Midway, and later Guam played major roles in defeating Japan as submarine bases, even though submarines made up a small portion of the Allied navies, less than 2% in the cases of the U.S. Navy. So what it sounds like from what you said and what I just read, and yes, guys, I'm reading off a script. We research and write on scripts, is that the U.S. Navy didn't have a very big submarine fleet. And I think that, when you look at it in the grand scheme of pre-1945 and post-1945, it doesn't fit what we think would have happened, because we all know about the Cold War and everything like that as far as submarines are concerned. But before that, we were not the major submarine. Nimitz was pretty much the one that invented this stuff. So we don't go into that in this show, but maybe if I do a show on Nimitz at one point, we'll talk about it. But anyway, submarines strangled Japanese by sinking its merchant fleet. So we pretty much were performing the same tactics the Germans were doing in the Atlantic in the Pacific to the Japanese. They cut off nearly all the oil imports essential to weapons production and military operations. And by early 1945, the Japanese oil supplies were so limited that its fleet was virtually stranded in place out in the Pacific Ocean because we were able to utilize submarines so effectively. The Japanese military claimed its defenses sank 468 Allied submarines. That's Allied. That's again, just like you said, that is the entirety of the Allied submarines. So 468 Allied submarines sank during the war. In reality, only 42 American submarines were sunk in the Pacific due to hostile action, with 10 others lost in accidents or as a result of friendly fire, which I don't even want to get into that. That creeps me out. The Dutch lost 5 submarines due to Japanese attack or minefields, and the British lost 3. So yeah, you have almost like a switch in the tactics and what was going on. So in the Atlantic, the Germans dominated and were the terrors of the sea, so to speak. But in the Pacific, when you look at it from the Japanese point of view, we were the ones who were the terrors as far as submarine warfare. So obviously there is a difference between the 468 that the Japanese claim, when the U.S. said it only lost 42, 52 if you count the 10 from accident, the Dutch 5, the Dutch, and 3 from the British. But I'm just going to say it, guys. Let's be honest. We are just as guilty of cooking the books as far as statistics are concerned as our enemies are. And so I would probably say that it's very likely that the Japanese and the Americans, you probably split the difference, and that's probably so I would say that probably somewhere between 52 and 468, somewhere in between there is the accurate number. Japanese submarines at Pearl Harbor. This is one of the stories that we're going to tell you guys about because this is interesting. So on 7 December 1941, Japanese military forces launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in what was then the Hawaiian Territory. Couple things. One, yes, I know everyone knows about Pearl Harbor. 2, a lot of people don't realize that Hawaii wasn't a state at that point. It was just a territory. So as part of the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy sent an attack group of submarines to surround Oahu and sink ships attempting to flee. At least that was what we believe. 5 of the submarines carried what was called top-secret mini-subs. So you understand this. I want you to think about a full-size sub with a little baby sub tied to the top of it, right? And those mini-submarines were these little submarines called midget subs or mini-subs tied to the top of these large submarines. So these 5 submarines launch. Each one of them has a mini-sub attached to the top of it. Those mini-subs, you think about it, if the big submarines there were intended to shoot down anybody trying to flee, what were the mini-subs there to do, right? And so that's where the mystery of what happened in Pearl Harbor comes full circle, is what were the mini-subs' jobs and what was their intent? Because the big subs were intended to stop people from fleeing. So we find out later on. The submarines were each armed with 2 torpedoes, the mini-subs, and carrying 2 crew members. They were made to penetrate inside the harbor under cover of darkness before the attack began. They were then to surface and fire their torpedoes during the aerial attack, and then they would dive and escape the harbor and rendezvous with their mother submarines, again under cover of darkness, the night of December 7th. While the aerial attack was devastating, the mini-submarines failed in their mission. Only one made it into the harbor, and it was quickly sunk during the attack in the morning. Another submarine washed ashore in the morning of December 8th, and its surviving crew member, Kazu Samuraki, was captured along with his craft. But did the subs fail? In 2002, a sunk Japanese mini-sub was discovered just outside the entrance to the harbor. This and the fact that there is a famous aerial photo of Battleship Road during the attack that has been analyzed and found to show a mysterious rectangular object in the water, and trailing off of that object is a torpedo heading towards the USS Oklahoma. Both the USS Oklahoma and the USS West Virginia were both sunk during the attack by torpedoes, and for a long time were attributed to planes that had dropped. They had planes that had torpedoes attached to the bottom of them that would drop them in the water, and they would launch into the water off these planes. For years, that's what they said sunk these 2. It has been the subject of debate from survivors who were on the boats and saying, no ship dropped it. No, there was no plane that dropped a torpedo. We got hit from some kind of a sub. That's what the survivors say. And all of the experts say, no, there was no sub inside Pearl Harbor. But this photo contradicts that. That and the fact that they found this sunken mini-sub just outside, inside what was called dredge shake. Now, dredge shake is when they're dredging out the harbor to make it deep enough for the ships to come in and out, which has to be done every couple of years. They're pretty sure that this sunken sub had been pulled out with the dredge and dumped in this area because of the conditions of the actual the conditions that it was in, which means that at one point this sunken sub was actually in the harbor, sunk. That debunks the whole they didn't get into the harbor and failed in their mission. One of these subs got into the harbor. The sub itself did not have its 2 torpedoes anymore, which means 2 torpedoes were launched from this sub. Both the Oklahoma and the West Virginia were sunk during the attack by torpedoes. I think it's pretty clear that it's very likely that this sub had made it into the harbor. It did launch its 2 torpedoes. One of them is immortalized in photo.
Yep, I'm looking at it right now.
Yeah,
actually.
So you can see the rooster tail in the water behind this square device that's in the water, and then you can see the trail of the actual torpedo going towards the USS Oklahoma. And this is a photo that was taken by Japanese aircraft during the attack. That was actually just, and it'd been in the archives for years. And a lot of people had looked at it and they're like, well, we don't know what that is. And that doesn't work. When you're trying to argue that there were no Japanese subs in the harbor, that's got to be something else. Doesn't work. What is it then if it's not that? It's an actual square device. There is something that is large in the water, and a torpedo is coming off of it towards towards one of the ships. Two, actually. I mean, looking at the picture, that it definitely it shows both off. Yeah, it shows both torpedoes being launched. That doesn't fit. That doesn't fit with their story of the fact that this sub didn't make it in. What it appears happened was somehow during the attack, this sub got destroyed and sunk. Never made it out of the harbor. Got pulled out with dredge during the cleanup. It doesn't take away from the fact that the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor happened and that submarines took a part in it because everyone knows that they were there. It does mean that they did get a submarine into the harbor within firing distance of our actual submarine of our ships, and that 2 of the 5 ships that were sunk on the Battle of Pearl Harbor were sunk by submarines. Yep. What do you think after looking at the picture and then your interpretation of it all? I mean, it's absolutely conceivable, even likely. I think that judging by where they found the sub and the fact that they found other ones outside the harbor, I think that they absolutely I believe that they participated in the attack. Did they make Pearl Harbor more catastrophic than it would have been if it was just an air assault? No. But, looking at this picture, I can absolutely see that, yes, there was a submarine there, and yes, it launched torpedoes. Yeah. And here's the thing. I don't understand the historic and the denial of it all. I mean, the Japanese openly admit, yes, we launched 5 mini-subs to try to get into the harbor. And so was it just because they said no, maybe they were trying to, for the sake of everyone chilling out about the attack, say, no, they don't have the advantage. They couldn't have done this. Yeah. That's the only thing I could think of, because historically, so many things were sunk that I just don't understand the expert denial that this happened. It still pales in comparison to the fact that they surprise attacked us with an entire aerial fleet on that day. It's secondary to it. So I don't understand the hatred of it all. It's the official story, and people, Jeff, people don't like it when you question the official story. Yeah, I guess not. But how many times did the official story get wrong? So, speaking of official stories, this one is not in question, but it is odd the time period that this happened. So, why don't you talk to us, Andrew, about our Second World War II submarine story? Sure. So, we're going to talk about the USS Indianapolis. So, if you have read any history, you know that we dropped atomic bombs on Japan. We did? Yeah, I know. Shocking, right? I think I did a show on it. So the Indianapolis was a Portland-class heavy cruiser in the United States Navy, obviously named for the city of Indianapolis, Indiana. It was the flagship for the commander of Scouting Force 1 for 8 years prior to World War II, and then served as the flagship for Admiral Raymond Spruance between 43 and 44, while he commanded the 5th Fleet in battles across the Central Pacific in World War II. This boat had been around for a while and had, served its purpose admirably. In 1945, the Indianapolis was sunk by a Japanese submarine, and it led to the greatest single loss of life at sea from a single ship in the history of the U.S. Navy. What makes this extra kind of, I don't want to say important, but, extra notorious. Yep. Is that the ship was just finished a high-speed, ultra-classified trip to the U.S. Air Force Base to deliver parts of Little Boy, the first nuclear weapon ever used in combat, and was on her way to the Philippines on training duty. At just after midnight on July 30th, 1945, the ship was torpedoed by a Japanese naval submarine, specifically the I-58, and sank in less than 12 minutes. Think about the quick. I mean, big holes in big ships going down fast. That's right. There were just short of 1,200 crewmen on board, 1,195 to be exact. 300 went down with the ship. The remaining 900
faced exposure, dehydration, saltwater poisoning, and repeated attacks by sharks while floating in a few lifeboats and flotation devices with no food or water. The Navy eventually learned of the sinking when survivors were spotted 4 days later by a patrol aircraft out on patrol. At the end of the day, when ships made it out to pick them up, only 316 of 1,200 crew members had survived.
Yeah, the big deal with this thing is that the official surrendering by the Japanese military forces had already occurred when this ship was sunk. And that doesn't mean that these guys went against the surrender and fired upon it, but the word had not spread out to all the Japanese forces yet that, hey, we surrendered, we're done. So these guys were sunk and killed after the surrender. And if you ever want to hear a really good telling of what happened with the USS Indianapolis, you need go no further than the classic 1970s movie Jaws, where Quint says,
Japanese submarine slammed 2 torpedoes into our side, Chief. He was coming back from the island of Tinian to Leyte, just delivered the bomb, the Hiroshima bomb. 1,100 men went into the water. Vessel went down in 12 minutes. Didn't see the first shark for about half an hour. Tiger, 13-footer. You know that when you're in the water, Chief? You tell by looking from the dorsal to the tail. What we didn't know was our bomb mission had been so secret, no distress signal had been sent.
And he talks about being on the Indianapolis. And yes, he's a fictional character, but the whole story of the Indianapolis is immortalized in that movie, in the scene where he talks about being on the Indianapolis, getting into the water. 900 men go in the water, 300 come out the water. He does the whole thing where the sharks eating the shit out of everyone, hence his hatred for sharks. But it is one of the worst events that has ever happened. And there is a show that I love called Just the Worst. And on Just the Worst podcast, Valentina and Patty talk about the sinking of the USS Indianapolis. And I'm going to link their episode where they talk about the Indianapolis to the show notes page, and recommend anybody that wants to hear the full story of what happened and all the terrible things that happened to these guys. They can go listen to it over there at Just the Worst podcast. And obviously Just the Worst, it's just the worst of humanity is kind of the way the podcast thing goes. And it talks about all kinds of horrific things, and they have a show on the Indianapolis. And so I recommend going and listening to that. We are going to stop it right there for today, guys. We will pick up next week with part 2 of the Silent Service. In the meanwhile, I recommend that you guys go check out, as I said right there at the end, Just the Worst podcast with Patty and Valentina. Those guys haven't put out a show in a couple weeks. We are patiently waiting as your fans for another show to come out. And when we come back next week, we are going to pick up with post-World War II. Me and Andrew will go through World War II all the way up to present day with some more terrible incidents occurring with submarines and some more of the submarine warfare history. Dia Press Lee Bear, guys. Keep it real, and we will see you next week.
Change your POV and all of its shows can help and heal and even educate. We want you to help us help others. Visit our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/changeyourpov. Become a patron of our network and our mission.